Aloha and welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Lynette Cruz. I'm your host. Thank you so much for joining us. I have this really fabulous guest sitting on my right. This is Umi Perkins. And if you watched the last program that we taped here, it was with Umi also. So this is like Umi Perkins 2. But there was so much to talk about. We really didn't have a chance to get to all the stuff that we wanted to share. So Umi, thank you for joining us. And again, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself for those who are watching for the first time, and please do.
Okay, mahalo for having me again. For those who maybe didn't see the last program, I'm a teacher. I teach at Kamehameha Schools and Windward Community College. I teach Hawaiian history at Kamehameha and political science at Windward. Including Hawaii politics.
Let me just interrupt for one moment.
Yeah.
If you watched it last time, the title of that program was Privatizing Aina, which kind of caught a lot of people. And this program is titled Aina and Mana, which is even more compelling. So sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to inject that before you go on.
No, that's a good point. So maybe for those who didn't see the last one or are fuzzy on the details, I could do just to do a quick review. My methodology, the idea of privatizing Aina is based on my dissertation, and the full title of the dissertation, which I didn't mention last time, was Kuleana, A Genealogy of Native Tenant Rights. So genealogy was my methodology, and it was a hybrid method using Hawaiian mo'okuauhau and seeing how that interacts with a more philosophical method of genealogy, which is in a lot of ways the opposite, looking at breaks in these narratives that we think bring us to where we are. A secondary part of that method was called theoretical encounter, which was looking at the way that ideas meet. Ideas over land in this case, and I had mentioned last time this contrast between land as a relation, land as kin, and land as an asset, land as real estate. So I look at traditional Hawaiian land tenure and into the question of whether or not it was feudal. And I kind of fall in the middle between those who, 100 years ago would say that it was feudal and those who say that it isn't feudal. My view is simply that feudalism was a bridging concept, a way to bridge the fact that Hawaiian land tenure was layered. This kind of brings me to this idea that I've been thinking about lately. I had a post on my blog, which is called the Umiverse. It was called The Psychology of Malama Aina. And in that I look at what is the mindset that you have to have in order to practice Malama Aina. It's not one that comes really naturally to us.
You mean naturally to us today?
Today, I mean, I was glad the other day to be with you in the lo'i at Papahana Kuaola in He'eia. Because it kind of made me realize I'd been getting soft in terms of, back when I was Lahaina Luna board, I used to work on the land every day.
You're a full-time academic now.
Yeah. But it's a practice that you have to try to maintain. So we look at things like the pesticides on Kauai. That's what we shouldn't be doing. Programs like, Hui Ku Maoli Ola bring us back to what we should be doing, a different way of thinking. I can talk more about that later, but
maybe a different way of relating. I'm just thinking about it as you're speaking, because since I was at Papahana Kuaola also, I was witness to some really interesting behaviors, and I was able to hear people say just the most interesting, loving and kind things. in talking about our ancestors, but also in talking about the ground. So sorry not to interrupt you, but
No, but speaking about Aina, I mean, some people believe that Aina, Aina is not, it's not all land. It's not the sand on the beach. It's not the ridges of the mountaintops. It's arable land. Some people say it's actually just the lands where you can have lo'i kalo. And in that lo'i the other day, that was the deepest one I'd ever been in. This idea of being immersed in the land is something that's it's hard to write about in an academic context. It's something that has to be sort of experiential. Another thing you got to witness was me up to my chest in mud.
that's right.
That's not
And
too common these days.
But also you in the context of your ancestors.
Right. The
Those
Ku'e
names.
petition boards.
Yeah. So we
was it?
should explain a little bit about what that was.
Yeah.
So on Saturday, this past Saturday, the 28th of June, Kalei Mailiali Hawaiian Civic Club was hosted by Papahana Kuaola, and we were allowed to, invited to, place the signs with the names of our kupuna who signed the Ku'e petitions, those petitions that protested annexation of Hawaii to the United States in 1897. We had some 2,300 names transcribed from the petition to these boards, and every single one of them was placed in the ground, in the lo'i, alongside the stream, in the mud, in the water. A lot of them got dirty, and it was a fascinating experience because somewhere along the line in laying these signs out, all of these people I didn't even know, children included, they came alive. They became the people who were named. And when you think about it that way, they have come into our space and they're there. So they got to witness all of us doing the other stuff, pulling the taro, pulling out weeds, being dirty, washing in the stream, having lunch. They were intimately connected as persons, not names, but as persons, as the embodiment, the best that we can do of our kupuna in the present time. That was profound.
It really is, and it really brings out the profundity of those petitions, which I think most people basically get, but sometimes the extent of it gets a little bit lost. I mean, if it was 95% of Hawaiians, then try to imagine that a comparable petition in the United States. You'd be talking about 285 million people signing a petition, 285 million out of 300 million Americans agreeing on something. That's completely inconceivable. And yet in Hawaii, that the equivalent of that happened. 2,300 signs is about 10%, a little over 10% of the signatures that are on there. But I was just lucky enough to find that my great-great-grandfather was one of the names, and my great-granduncles, and then some other more indirect relatives. But the idea of petitions was something that was brought here by missionaries and related people in what I came to call the moral political economy, which related to land, where land was seen as something that needed to be used effectively. Even Captain Cook said Hawaiians had cultivated the land to the greatest degree of perfection. And yet, when the missionaries came, they didn't really see it that way, and they had this idea of the Hawaiians as gentlemen farmers, that the ali'i would be large estate owners, and the Hawaiian makainana would be like small tenants or small independent landowners eventually. So this moral political economy, the idea that the economy has a moral dimension to it, that's where the missionaries meet capitalism. It's another thing I looked at. Then I looked at the kuleana itself, the idea of kuleana itself. And I had mentioned last time the reason I titled the dissertation Kuleana is because the translations have been part of the problem, that native tenant rights doesn't really capture the idea of kuleana very well at all. And then moving on to the mahele and the structure of the mahele. So kuleana, as I mentioned before, was a bundle of rights, the most fundamental of which was the ability to divide out a vested right that you're born with and convert that right into an actual object, a fee simple title to a piece of land, 3 acres on average. And this idea of converting a right to an object is kind of central to my research. It's a pretty basic idea, but one that people kind of need to be kind of brought through, explained through.
Oh, heck, I need it. Explain.
Well, this is the basic way that I explain it to my students is, you have the right to vote. Does that mean you did vote? And they know it doesn't mean you did vote. Once you vote, can you vote again in the same election? And they know that you can't. So you've converted a right, which is a potentiality, into an actual thing. So a vote into an actual say in the election, or a right to own land into actual land. So to me, that's something that it's pretty basic, but it gets lost in a lot of the histories of land in Hawaii, that Hawaiians have this vested right. And the question is, do contemporary Hawaiians retain that right? Do we have the right to, do we have that right that can be turned into an actual object?
How are you defining Hawaiian?
Lilikala Kamelihiva says Hawaiian is determined by genealogy. So you're a Hawaiian if you have a Hawaiian family. That's the way I think about it. So these definitions in the current laws, like descendants of those, descendants of the inhabitants from 1778, those work in the sense that they define the same group of people. And I think that's starting to be a fairly accepted definition, that definitions of, on one hand, 50%, which is a definition that was created by a bunch of Caucasian males in Washington, D.C., who the only Hawaiian they knew was Prince Kuhio. That's the one extreme. And the other extreme, people who say Hawaiian is a kind of a feeling, that if you do certain things and you feel a certain way, that somehow makes you Hawaiian. I don't really use those definitions. They're kind of in the middle, I think, in that it's about genealogy. It's about family. That the Maori define themselves that in the same way, that you're a Maori if you're a member of a tribe, and you're a member of the tribe because you're related to the original descendant that created that tribe. So it is a Polynesian definition, I think.
What about the more contemporary national definition?
Oh.
Might as well bring that up, because that's kind of where we are today with all of these. Well, what's going on in Hawaii right now? Okay,
I should backtrack. I know you had Donovan on the show, and I watched part of that, and he had very, very precise definitions of Hawaiian, and I do agree with that. And when you said Hawaiian, I was thinking Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka Oiwi. So I might say that I'm defining Kanaka Oiwi that way as genealogy. But
no wonder these issues are so difficult to talk about. And seriously, you got to define all your terms before you even begin, because we don't even know half the time if the person we're talking to is really talking about what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I use those words interchangeably in my work. But I also think it's true that there were probably 2,000 non-native Hawaiian citizens of the kingdom, and that's the group that's really being disenfranchised in the hearings recently. It's a denial of the history of the kingdom to cut those people out, and that includes the descendants of Sanford Dole and all those people. You can't have it both ways. If you're going to pick a definition, you have to take what comes with that, and I'm okay with that. So yeah, I think there's Kanaka Oiwi or Kanaka Maoli. In the kingdom, Kanaka Maoli is pure Hawaiians, right? Kanaka Oiwi is all Hawaiians, and then there's Hawaiian by a citizenship definition. I think those are can both be true at the same time. And speaking of that, the Kuleana right was only for Kanaka Oiwi. It was not for non-native citizens of the kingdom. So it was a way of bringing the traditional understandings of land tenure and people's relation to land into a modern system, is to vest those rights to land in the natives only, and not in the citizenry, but the natives only. In the dissertation, I look at Kuleana before the Mahele, even though the Mahele came before the Kuleana Act, because the idea of Kuleana underlies the Mahele. The idea of who has rights is more fundamental than the process of dividing out those rights. So just to close a kind of a review section, the Mahele was structured in that there were the three owners of the land. The king, the government, the konohikis, the ali'i. They're ali'i, but they get land in their capacity as the supervisors of Ahupa'a and Ili. And then the Ho'aina, the friends of the land, that's the Maka'ainana. And then here's where I wanted to make a correction from what I said last time. You had asked a question which was, if there's three layers, what is the fundamental layer? What happened was that I'd been thinking about this in terms of layers for so long. The layers in that case are really just a metaphor, that those interests among the three classes are undivided. So they actually aren't layers. To say that there are layers is to draw a division when there is none. So there isn't a fundamental layer in that sense. And that's why I had to do a kind of a roundabout answer about where the government falls in this this level of land ownership that we call dominium. And just to review that, you have fee simple title. In one layer you have fee simple title, leaseholds, and life estates, what we normally think of as ownership. Underlying that is dominium, and that's what's divided into three: government, konohiki, and ho'aina. And then above it, above fee simple title, you have gathering rights, which we had talked about the Pash decision affirming those rights. Those are like usage rights. And then after the last show, I spoke to somebody who asked me if I'd ever thought about the burials, the graves, as like another layer. And I can kind of see that in terms of a metaphor, but one of the layers that I'm talking about are strictly legal layers. But it's an interesting idea to think about, sort of a subsurface too, but that's more metaphorical. So that's kind of a review of what we talked about last time.
I guess we need 1 more hour, but go ahead.
So one part I didn't get to last time was these native tenant rights are in place. If you are the oligarchy, if you are a small group trying to dominate a very large group, a portion of which has very fundamental rights. Sanford Dole is an intelligent person. He knows that Hawaiians have these rights, and he's a judge in the Supreme Court of the kingdom. And that's going to be a problem for his primary interest, which is the plantations. So how do you address those? I call it responses to native tenant rights. You might call it attacks on native tenant rights. It's things that were done to try to undermine, try to end, try to distract from those fundamental rights. And I found 3 major things. The first one was the land court. So Hawaii is one of the relatively few places that has two methods of registering land title. The first system, the normal system that they call the regular system. It's not a very good name, but that's what they call it. And then in addition to that is the land court. So if you have a piece of land with a very clouded title, you can go to the land court, and for a pretty hefty fee, you can bring documents, maps, land titles, testimony, and submit it to the land court, and a judge of the land court gives you a second title to your land. So when you buy a piece of property in Hawaii, on your deed it's going to say what system the land is registered in. It's on Oahu, it's usually going to be both the regular system and the land court. And my understanding is on outer islands, it's usually the regular system and only rarely the land court. So the land court, what it's essentially doing is politicizing a legal issue, right? Land ownership should be fairly clear. It's supposed to be set up to where it's black and white. You own it or you don't own it. But there are so many cases in Hawaii with heirship, multiple heirs, life estates that people don't understand that they're life estates, 999-year leases, which was something that Dole established. All these things created clouds on title. So there are a lot of lands with clouds on the title, meaning unclear who the owner was. It was not black and white. So Dole himself introduced the land court system, which they call the Torrens system. There's a man named Robert Torrens in Australia who created the system. He based the system on the registering of ships. And the fact that it's from Australia is interesting because in Australia, the legal doctrine that they used to claim land there was called terra nullius. This is somewhat well known. Terra nullius meaning empty land. They said nobody's here, or at least nobody whose government we're bound to respect or can really recognize. So it was a blank slate as far as they were concerned. And then in that case, it might make sense. Now, disregarding the fact that there are all kinds of Aborigines everywhere with title, if you don't recognize that, then you can imagine why a system that just sort of claims land, in a sense, might make sense, at least from their perspective. But to bring that here, where we already have a very well-established private property system, this is 50 years after the Mahele, talking 1903, this was set up, is a way of basically extinguishing people's rights to land. Robert Stauffer notes that no land court title has ever been overturned. But it's simply a judge making a decision that you own this and not you. So that was one way to respond or extinguish native tenant rights, was the land court. Another way was a case called Dowsett versus Maukeala, which has been widely interpreted as the sort of precedent case that says there are no more native tenant rights. But in my research, I really question that. I question whether that's even what the case was really about. It gets complicated, but basically, whenever somebody asserts native tenant rights, that would be the case they would point to say no, they no longer exist. Dowsett versus Maukeala. And then the third method of responding to native tenant rights was non-judicial foreclosure. So that is a foreclosure procedure that doesn't involve any court. There's no court oversight. It's simply a private business contract. And so I remember when I started doing the research, when I would look in the sort of classified ads section or the legal notice section of the newspaper, it would be about half and half for foreclosures, normal foreclosures and non-judicial. So Robert Stauffer showed in his study of Kahana Valley that land wasn't stolen in the sense that we normally think of it. It was simply foreclosed on. Those were, Hawaiians had land, they didn't have cash to develop the land, and they would borrow money from often foreigners, and it would be a private loan. There's no oversight. It's very high interest, very short term. So maybe 25% interest. In 3 years, you pay back the full amount plus 25%. And if you don't, there was a non-judicial foreclosure method to seize the land. He shows that most of Kahana Valley native tenants lost their land that way through non-judicial foreclosure, and that was a law passed in 1874. So it's a kingdom law, actually. The head of the House of Nobles at the time was Charles Reed Bishop. You can draw your own conclusions about that, but those are 3 methods I saw of trying to attack or undermine native tenant rights. And the reason this is important is I think there are people out there who might still be able to undo, or at least we can question whether these institutions and structures that were set up are really legitimate, or are they just established purely in the interest of sugar plantations and the large, the Big Five and so on. The next thing I did was I looked at case studies. I tried to look at a few cases of to see, do these theories that I just have gone over, do they actually make sense in specific cases? One case is the Crown lands. So last time I had mentioned a genealogy or a false genealogy of the laws of Hawaii, right? Where Lauren Thurston named the Treaty of Annexation as one of the fundamental laws of Hawaii, a treaty which never existed. I did the same thing with the sequence of ownership of Crown lands. So if you follow, who owns the Crown lands, starting with the Mahele, Kamehameha III, and the 4th and 5th, and it goes down to Lili'u, and then supposedly it gets transferred to the federal government in 1898, and then to the state government in 1959. But there's a few breaks in there, and I'm not the only one saying this. I mean, there was the lawsuit in 2009. John Osorio was a plaintiff in that. Bill Meheula was involved in it, and they're saying that the sequence doesn't actually work, that it can't really be shown that the state owns those lands. And there's a couple of points where those ruptures might be. One is the case in re His Majesty Kamehameha V. It was the transition of passing the crown lands from Kamehameha IV to Kamehameha V. Queen Emma sued for the dowry, saying that crown lands should go to the spouse. And in that case, the Chief Justice Robertson said, the crown lands are a special type of ownership. They're not exactly fee simple. They go to the next monarch. And that's how you get from, to Lunalilo and then to Kalakaua. It's not heirship, it's by who's on the throne. Keanusai says that that's a special type of title, not fee simple, but it's called fee tail, meaning it doesn't go to all the heirs of your body, it goes to a specific heir that you name. A fee tail is a pretty archaic term, so that's somewhat debatable. So that's one sort of sticking point, is that court case, 1864 or so. And then Another one is the lawsuit Liliuokalani versus the United States in 1910. She sued for revenue from Crown lands, saying these are my lands, they're simply seized, I should be getting some kind of revenue. And the U.S. Supreme Court actually pointed to the previous case, saying in that case with Kamehameha V, they had basically converted the lands to public lands, and therefore they're not your private property. But I would suggest that that's highly, highly problematic. And so you have these kind of breakages, and that's not even to mention the overthrow itself, which transferred the crown lands from the Queen to the provisional government, and then annexation, which transfers it from the republic to the federal government. So there's so many breakages, and that's the basis of John Van Dyke saying that that it should be transferred to the Hawaiian governing entity. So that's one case study, and then the other case study was called Olave, and what I really look at there is in the transfer of Koho'olawe from the federal government back to the state in 1991. It was transferred by what they call a quitclaim deed. And a quitclaim deed is kind of as it sounds, you're quitting or giving up any claim to that land. If you were to go out and buy land, you wouldn't want to buy something that would you receive a quitclaim deed, because all it's saying is the person who gave you that doesn't own it. They're not saying that they ever did own it. And so it's as if the federal government is saying that they never necessarily own Ka'olave. So that kind of throws a big wrench in a lot of these things. And Ka'olave is part of the so-called ceded lands. So I also looked at Makua, but I think those first two really show that that the laws and the sequence of events does not follow, that there are these ruptures, and that should cause us to really question how we got to where we are today in terms of land ownership. So I know you wanted to talk about the relation to politics today.
Well, actually, what I wanted to do is, I think the research is valuable, but I'm really interested in application of knowledge. So we're learning all of this stuff, not just from you, but from the research of others, and wondering how to use that information to give us a better understanding of what's going on today. There's all kinds of things going on like today, right now. How useful is it?
The one way I think about my own research is that it could be used as almost like a guidebook for those who are trying to recover lands. I think that there's the works that are out there are often, even the good ones are kind of partial. Look at John Chinen, for example. He actually has a fairly good description of what happened in Mahele, but unless you understand every term and have the context yourself, it's pretty easy to get confused by that. And then there are other works that kind of are almost like diversions, and there's so many works that are based on those previous works. I think Donovan Preza shows that almost all work on the Mahele traces back to 6 original sources, secondary sources. And that's pretty profound. That means people are just repeating what other people said. So I think as far as application, it's going to be a pretty academic guidebook, but a guidebook. And I said that in my I submitted it to review with a university press, and then they said, what is the potential market for this book? And I'd said, one market is Hawaiians doing, land research to try to reclaim land. And it's an indigenous, it's a series in sort of indigenous studies. So that's something that that does interest them. So that's one way. That's one way it kind of applies to today. When I've described it to people, you know, up on the hill at Kamehameha, this is just sort of a metaphor. They kind of look out and they say that all this, because we have the view, right? All this is based on a lie, you know, because it really has the potential to undermine a lot of what's going on out there. Land ownership is pretty fundamental. So that's kind of a second, more general way that it's applicable. And then a third way, it's not as direct, but really trying to understand our history affects us in the Department of Interior hearings, which are still going on. It's hard to give people a history lesson in a 2-minute statement, but so many people are doing it that the message, I think, is starting to become clear. And I think, and we were commenting about this before the show, that the knowledge of Hawaiian history in the population, at least the population that goes to hearings, has been kind of ratcheted up quite a bit. And that's partly because the research is happening, and partly because of this dissemination that's been able to happen through media and social media. And so I think that's 3 ways in which it's directly and indirectly kind of applicable.
Good enough for me. The reality is, and I think I mentioned it at our first talk, meetings are being held everywhere, and there's anxiety on the part of some to move something forward, anything. Let's get a process going and let's just do this, this, and this, because we pretty much know all there is to know, or we have enough information.
Yeah.
That's something I find frightening myself. I don't have enough information. I want to move forward too, but I don't want to. I would like to learn from other people's mistakes. I would not want to jump into something without knowing what the impacts are going to be, to the best of my knowledge. So, and I want to prepare. And I think being forewarned, forearmed, yeah, information is good. The more you have, the better, because at some point you will be able to use it, and maybe somebody won't be able to call you on it, if you know what I mean. It's better to know.
I agree. Although if I can just bring up a story, you know, I think it was the last year's La Ho'iho'i'ea, you know, the Restoration Day in July.
Which is coming up, by the way, on the 26th of this month.
Yes.
Just a plug.
Yes. There was a panel with Kuhio Vogler,
Mai Van
Lam, and Dexter Kaiyama. And that was, to me, that was a turning point. In my mind, it was a turning point. You had Kuhio arguing with Dexter about extreme nuances in international law, in the Hague Conventions, and these things about the Cleveland Agreement of Restoration, and whether and what they call the Lili'u Okalani assignment, where Lili'u, according to this analysis, assigns her executive authority to Cleveland, and then the logic is that it remains with the executive of the United States all the way until the current executive. And they were going back and forth, and Maivan was mostly quiet, and towards the end she said, the people who actually work in international law in the UN don't take these laws as seriously as you guys are. Now, out of the 3, Maivan is the one who actually teaches international law. And so that was just, what that told me was, we might be past the point where more knowledge is going to get us more progress. And I'm not saying we shouldn't learn more. I'm very much inclined to studying more rather than even, I'm more of an idea person than an action person, I have to admit. And so that's not my natural inclination to say we know enough. But that exchange kind of said to me that we might be at the point where we know enough, and it's really more about political action. And
Maybe I should have defined the we. Who is it that I'm talking about? And really, I'm talking about man in the street, Makainana,
yeah.
who went from all the way up there in a very short time.
Yeah.
From knowing very little, if anything at all, about history to knowing enough to make a credible testimony in front of the Department of Interior. That was good.
I know I saw somebody at one of the hearings, just a picture this morning or yesterday, of somebody with an iPad that said belligerent occupation. That's a pretty technical term, which a lot of people still don't understand. So yeah, there's
yes, but they're being armed, and
yeah.
in a way, without being aware of what it is, without understanding the depth of what they're saying. So they're armed and they're letting fly without really being aware of what all of that implies. But it's as if they don't have to, because the information is coming so fast that they're able to craft something and put a statement out in a public way and have people listen and agree. It's an amazing thing. That's kind of what I meant about the information you're sharing. For example, enough people will be who will be watching this, will take away from it information that you've shared and will be using that. They will, to bolster an argument that they're already making about some really fine points. This is like amazing to me.
You know, I went to a meeting of political activists just 2 days ago, and you know, because I had been working kind of in the area of law, land law, international law, how those two intersect. Whereas at this meeting of activists, it's really about power, and it's about power at the grassroots level. How does that build up? How do people organize and then confront power? Recently I wrote an article called Law and Power, where I look at those two sides. I mean, that's essentially, to me, that's the sort of that's the split that's happening right now within the Hawaiian movement, is those who are strictly following the law, that is independence. They're saying no treaty, no annexation, Hawaii remains sovereign. And then those who really focus on power, who say the United States won't let this happen. And I tried to find a way to bridge over the two concepts, because then if you heal that divide, then you have a pretty powerful force in the Hawaiian community. It's difficult, but a lot of it is the psychology of what's happening in the sort of the subconscious, that most people have sort of, you might even say, fascist tendencies that they suppress. That on the surface they're Democrats with a small, the lowercase d, and they really believe in democracy, but underneath the surface, at a deep level, they actually have a kind of a rage for order that translates to kind of fascist tendencies. But they're completely unaware of it. So I think...
You don't think that shows?
A lot of the place where it manifests itself is not where you would expect. It manifests in things like what kind of entertainment do they like to watch, behaviors that they exhibit that they're not fully conscious of, that they're reacting, and it comes out. I say they, I mean, it's really all of us, that we have these things in us. So all I'm saying is, if you can bring it to the surface and realize that maybe we're not all actually designed to participate in the processes that democracy requires. That we need to do it through conscious effort. It doesn't come naturally. That's getting kind of esoteric, but
I'm
I
good with
think
esoteric.
I think that's a way to start bridging the idea of law and power. Just to give a source, there's the philosopher Slavoj Žižek. He's kind of the big rock star philosopher nowadays. He says that on the surface, we want our governments to be democratic. We think that, okay, there's a free press, there's checks and balances, that everything's fine, but in reality, we actually have a sublimated desire to hear the message that our governments do whatever they want. And when you see the United States going out and just sort of taking places over, that appeals to that. This is not. I'm not excluding Hawaiians from this. It's a sort of sublimated, subconscious tendency. So that could be a way to bridge over the law and power divide, because it's a tricky one, and it's a very, very sharp divide. The two models that the two sides are pushing are pretty much mutually exclusive. You can't have a middle ground, or you can't have both.
I was thinking about our work day at Papahana Kuaola, and the use of those kupuna signs to bridge a particular gap. I don't know where people were politically, but it didn't really matter, because the focus, we are so American in our behavior. We really think it's about us. Me first, my family first. I got to do what's best for us. I need a job. I got to feed my kids, blah, blah. And the concept of community gets put on the side. Everybody else is like secondary.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was always that way. I kind of think it wasn't. And this idea of connecting to place, to person, to history, to our kupuna past, takes the issue of power and legalities, puts it on the side. It doesn't matter. What I saw happening, and I want to share this because I think it's important. People move forward on things because they have a particular drive to do it. You can't make them do anything. They come to it, and something else drives them to do a particular thing. I like to equate that to communing with the past, with our ancestors, and with the present as well. Maybe in the future too. It's communing. Messages are going all over the place, and our ability to hear and then to act takes all of the political stuff, and the legal, of course, out of the picture. It's not relevant. The reason I say that is because there's a certain high that comes with being able to commune. It's almost like religion. You get to a place where you recognize that your ancestors are calling you to do a particular thing, and you answer the call, and your life changes, and you get high. What is that high? I mean, like connection, that intimate connection that lets you know that you and your ancestors are in sync. When you get to that place, and I have seen it over and over, I taught too, so I could actually tell when students were moving into that area. You become selfless because it's not about themselves. There's some other thing. It's that other thing, which I'm not even sure what to call it, that to me is what bridges those intellectual understandings and practices, the power and the understanding history and the legal history and the rightness of it, which is like kind of floating around up there. It gives you a different kind of power. How does that manifest? You become generous. There's a generosity that comes with knowing that you have a particular power, You don't have to kill somebody. You don't have to, shred them, cut them down. You don't have to do it, because the power that you have transcends anything anybody could ever do to you or harm you. I saw it. I saw it happening in the Lo'i. I saw it happening in a discussion where people are moved to tears for I don't know what. I don't know. But I think they were moved because they were connected to something that was bigger than themselves. Just like that. They felt powerful. Maybe that's a different kind of power.
In developmental psychology, there are phases that people go through. You might call them levels.
I know, I was a psych undergrad.
And they're very well established. Different models go, you might say, higher than others, but they all basically correlate. But in everyday life, those levels are basically disregarded. That we're told that everyone's equal. Once you're 18, you're just like everybody else, and it's really a myth. This is where this connects back to education. I think I have started to do experiments where I try to focus the curriculum on trying to get people from one level to the next. If we're talking about the students that I teach, and I think a lot of people are doing this, it's trying to get them from me to we, or from au to kako. And that's a pretty basic thing that I think a lot of Hawaiian studies teachers are trying to get our Americanized students to understand that that you're part of a bigger group. And basically, in these levels of development, your circle of what you consider yourself expands. So first you don't even know who yourself is. You're nothing but sensations. Then you grow an ego, and then it's just you, and then it's your family maybe, and then it's your larger social group, might be a tribe, might be an ethnicity, and then it's a nation, and then there is a point where it goes beyond the nation. So in being in a
peace on earth, goodwill towards all things. That's
Right.
kind of like the end product, right?
Right.
All of a sudden, your kuleana stretched to the whole world.
So in being in a sovereignty movement, we also have to recognize that there's a level beyond that.
Yes,
there's a level where you connect to a global community, and then beyond even a global community, it can kind of go on and on. But people aren't really educated in that way. That's not the goal of education. The goal of education generally has been to fill an empty vessel with information, right? Not consciousness development.
I don't know. Is that true?
Most education, I would say,
Maybe it's at a high school level. I don't know. But certainly at the college level, it's no more empty vessels, man. Those vessels are full when they get here. And the point is to actually get them to, take some stuff out and put more stuff in.
Actually, it's true that at the college level, at the graduate school level, you're talking about postmodernism, and that's a level, and it's just that it thinks it's the last level. There's another one, that kind of movement through the levels is very, very difficult work, and most people never get past the third or fourth level, or even the second.
I don't think that's our responsibility. With teachers, I guess we're shifting all over the place here, but the best you can do is to trigger something in them, the students, so that they go by themselves. So I think that's been my job, is to give them enough to make them want to go beyond that, because I am certainly not taking them there. Who has time for that? But they are moved. Something moves them to go beyond. And then I feel successful. I feel like, right on, because that's the best that I can give you, and I don't have any more, because I got, like a zillion other things I got to do with other students.
Yeah, I will only have them for a semester. What I try to do, it's a short time, I try to show them a map of, at some point you might be here on this map, you might think this. It gives them some kind of path to at least think about. It's not just random. But that's where Malama Aina comes back in, is that it's when you can connect to Aina, you can realize that there's something bigger than yourself, something that's been here longer, that will outlive you.
That's the mana that you were talking about then for the title. Is full of it. I mean, there's a lot of mana there, stuck in the ground, stuck to the ground, but kind of like floating around too and connected to our ancestors, and it's like one big package. And you start accepting a small part of it. It doesn't take long before you got the whole thing. They're all stuck together. You have to take it all at once, and then it's like a good thing. You can get high. I said that earlier. The purpose of, I think, life is to get high in some way. And if you can get high off of connecting with nature, with each other, with the land, it's kind of like cheap high, right? And you win. And you become very generous too. We're running out of time. Final comments. I don't know if we actually got to speak about everything that you wanted, but fairly close.
Yeah. I had actually been wanting to ask your thoughts, but you've kind of given some of them. I have been thinking about, well, just to connect to what you were saying, the mana that's in Aina, the traces of the history are in a sense are there. You know, I've had some pretty intense experiences in Nuuanu Valley, for example, and I don't go there to like have picnics and things like that anymore because of that. So I think there is a kind of mana. It's just that most people they can't really tap into it. It's not.
Trust yourself.
It's, yeah.
I think that's the best way to think about it. Is something's going to happen, and you're probably going to deny it. Most people do deny it, but they should sort of trust themselves. Thank you, Umi, for joining us tonight, and thoughtful discussion. I got to go home and think about like all of this stuff, and I'm really happy to have had you. And thank you for joining us too. I'm Lynette Cruz for Issues That Matter. My guest, Umi Perkins. Right on, Umi.
Hey, mahalo, Umi.
And thank you. See you guys again. There's more to come.